His PhD was on the early Iron Age in Rajasthan. He's also an expert in culinary anthropology, for which he has been appearing on programs which have made him famous across India, and with a great interest in food archaeology, of course, also history and art. Today, we are looking at how orality does make a story really come to life, and how orality often proves what people who are archaeologists or people who are sociologists, etc., later discover. We've always heard of the landing at Sanjan, sugar in the milk, all these things. But it was Dr. Kurush Dalal's team working at Sanjan. And I've heard some fascinating stories in the little WhatsApp messages that have come back to me about how, in pouring rain, etc., Dr. Kurush Dalal was still working at Sanjan despite all the weather, despite all the problems. And people are so thrilled that somebody finally proved that yes, the Parsis were in Sanjan, yes, the Dakma was in Sanjan. He's going to be showing this to us. He's going to be sharing things with us. And I'm delighted to have you here, Dr. Kurush Dalal. I still remember your dig and the things you showed at the NCPA many decades, 2 decades ago, and how much it brought to us the fact that yes, we are rooted in this soil of India. With that, may I welcome you to please take over and do your presentation today. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you, audience, for also being here with us. Kurush Dalal.
Thank you very, very much, Mrs. Kama. Thank you very, very much to the Parso Foundation. Thank you very, very much to Geo Parsi and Matab and all the others over here. It's absolutely an honor to speak over here. And I hope I do a, well, partial justice, if not complete justice, to the topic in hand. So what I'm going to talk about is some of the work that I've been doing regarding the archaeology and the history of the Zoroastrians in trying to understand where our history comes from and how we've proved certain things that to us were mainly oral tradition. So I'm not going to take up too much time introducing the topic, and I'm going to start by sharing screen and by yeah. So what I'm going to talk about today is essentially the Zoroastrian sacred landscape, its archaeology and its history. I don't need to tell this crowd gathered over here today who the Parsis are, but as a matter of fact, because as an archaeologist, I go a lot by definition, the Parsis are essentially to me the descendants of a group of Zoroastrian refugees who fled Persia and arrived on the Indian mainland about 1200 years ago. According to their oral traditions, they established themselves and they established a city for themselves called Sanjan and lived here for 600 years before the city was destroyed. By this time, they had a considerable diaspora and a diasporic presence in Western India, and the new refugees, now double refugees or double diaspora because they had to leave Sanjan, soon found a safe place to restart their lives. The timeline that we are looking at is essentially from 641 AD to 1741 AD. So the Battle of Nehavan took place in 641 AD. It was the conclusive final battle that the Arabs and the Sassanids fought together. They lost, and the Sasanian Empire officially came to an end in 641, 642 AD at the Battle of Nehavan. In 651 AD, Yazdegerd Shahryar III died, a rather ignominious death. He was killed for the girdle which held his sword, which was jeweled and fitted out with gold. When he was saying his prayers, a miller smashed him on the back of the head to steal his sword girdle and pushed his body into the river. The story of this group of refugees who are today's Parsis started in 741 AD when these refugees essentially came down from the mountains of Khorasan, where they had been hiding, along with the last remnants of the Sasanian princes, and from Hormuz, after a stay of 30 years, says the Kissei Sanjan, they took ship to Diu. Somewhere around 790 AD, they left Diu and made landfall at Sanjan after a stay of 19 years on the island of Diu. And they stayed here at Sanjan, where they, in memory of Iran, lit a holy fire and created an Atash Beram with the alat that they had brought with them. No, they had not brought a fire with them. In memory of Iran and in thanksgiving for safe deliverance, they lit a fire which they named the Iran Shah. The Iran Shah stayed at Sanjan till Sanjan fell, when it was moved first into the hills of Barot, from there to the jungles of Baska, from there to Navsari, brief 3-year interregnum to Surat when Navsari was having Mughal issues, back to Navsari, and then finally in 1741, they moved to Udwada, where it is to this very day. So on the top left-hand side, you see the maximum spread of the Sasanian Empire in 622 AD, and it was one hell of an empire, as you can see from the map itself. Bordering India on the east, covering Egypt and parts of Libya on the southeast, all the way to the Hellespont, covering the entire Black Sea region, the whole of West Asia, the coast of the Persian Gulf, and that's why it's called the Persian Gulf, and the tip of Yemen, and extending all the way to Khwarezm in the north. By 632 AD, it was a beleaguered, under siege empire. There was an enormous amount of internecine warfare amongst the royal court. And when Yazdegerd Shahryar actually took the throne, he was the sole survivor of a major palace purge. The caliphate that replaced the Sassanid Empire was called the Rashidun Caliphate. And in 645-54 AD, it basically covered the whole of Arabia and was inching towards the Mediterranean. By 750 AD, the Umayyad Caliphate had extended all the way to the Atlantic and to the shores of India, where only the Gurjara Pratiharas and the Chalukyas of Navsari managed to hold them off. So this is basically the story of the Iran Shah that I told you. And these are the perhaps 6 most important places as far as the Zoroastrians are concerned: Sanjan, Barot, Basra, Navsari, and Surat, and Udwada. This is what we knew about the sacred landscape in a very general oral tradition kind of manner till about 2002 AD. So this was the Sanjan Column, and it was considered by the Zoroastrians that the Sanjan Column was placed at the spot where the Zoroastrians made landfall. This is actually completely fallacious. The Sanjan Column was built at this spot because somebody actually donated a patch of land for the memorial to be raised, and this spot has nothing whatsoever to do with the actual spot of the landing of the Zoroastrians. This fallacy has led to all kinds of controversies, which we will look at in a slight bit. This is the site of ancient Sanjan, and I'm going to come back to it in about 5 minutes. And this is the Sanjan's thumb and the Sanjan railway station. So as you can see, the Sanjan railway station and the Sanjan's thumb are in line on the railway line and the parallel road, okay, which was only built in the middle of the 19th century when the Maharaja Gaikwad of Baroda finally gave the British permission to build the BB and CI railways. The only Zoroastrian archaeology done before the excavations at Sanjan was a PhD carried out by a young Zoroastrian student who, while researching Sanjan, came to the sad conclusion that ancient Sanjan was in all probability buried under modern Sanjan and therefore completely and totally inaccessible. And this was sadly due to the Sanjan pillar being where it was and the misleading urban myth that this was the location where the Parsis first made landfall. Uh, when Sanjan fell, said the oral traditions, there was a 2-day battle, and after a pitched battle of 2 days, Sanjan fell, but it gave the Sanjana priests enough time to escape with the Iran Shah via the small village of Asavali or Aswali into the Barot mountains, where they hid in a set of caves. Now, this is the Barot mountain. This is a satellite view. And this is actually the ridge of caves that you see over here. These small excavations are 7/8 caves, depending on your numbering. And what you have to understand about this is that this again is a myth. The escape to Barot is not an issue. They're using the caves to hide in is an issue. The caves are essentially a set of water cisterns built on the edge of the plateau at Barot. And this is why they fled to Barot, because there was water available here. And it is the large flat area on top where the Iran Shah was temporarily housed. And there are a large number of plinths or houses that we have actually found subsequently. So this is the edge of the Barot plateau. And these are the various different tanks, as you see them over here, that have been cut out, which are called the Barot caves. This is the main Barot cave, as it's called. There is a series of steps going in. There are pillars. There is a pillared overhang. The Parsis regularly come here, whitewash the insides, and off and on there's a painted furrower inside too. And usually we do a small jasal before we go back if we can. This, as I told you, was originally a water cistern. You can still see the remnants of the water in the month of October over here. Close-up view of the Barot caves, unfinished caves at Barot, water cisterns, and the overview of Barot again. This, of course, is the Iran Shah, that is an older, very old photograph on the left-hand side, I'm told, and the new modern building with the very imposing statuary at the gate. You then, of course, have the layout over there at the Atash Beram. We have the Navsari Atash Beram and the Surat Atash Beram, both of which housed the Iran Shah and therefore are very much a part of the same sacred geography of the Zoroastrians. Now, coming to the archaeology of the Zoroastrians, the archaeology of the Parsis in India, as such, which we're going to talk about today, what I would like to tell you is that prior to our excavations at Sanjan, everything was oral tradition or hearsay. There was absolutely no proof that the Parsis had actually landed at Sanjan and therefore gone to Barot. In 2002, Dr. Homi Dhala of the World Zarastrixi Cultural Foundation approached Professor Mani Kamerkar and asked her whether it would be possible to ask the Archaeological Survey of India to declare the Barot Caves a protected monument, because this was the only real pilgrimage place apart from the Iran Shah that the Zoroastrians had. Dr. Kamerkar said it was not impossible to do so, but to actually do so, we would have to first ensure that we proved without doubt that the caves at Barot actually existed where they do. And to do so, we would have to actually prove the origins of Sanjan and the Parsi presence at Sanjan. And for this, they approached Dr. S.P. Gupta of the Indian Archaeological Society in Delhi, and they decided to conduct a series of excavations there. One Monday morning in November, I think it was the 2nd of November, 2002, I got a phone call asking me whether, 2001, I got a phone call asking me whether I would be interested in being the field director and subsequently the co-director of the Sanjan Excavations. This was like asking a young MBA whether he'd like to be a vice president at Tata Sons. I absolutely leapt up to this and said yes, but that I had something to finish in Pune and that I would be down a couple of days later and we could meet on Wednesday. So we met on Wednesday, Dr. Dhala, myself, and Dr. Kamerkar, who was then the vice president of the Asiatic Society. And they said, we would like to excavate Sanjan and we would like you to head the excavations. I said, that's fabulous. That means that we actually have an archaeological site at Sanjan. And they said, don't we? And I said, what do you mean by don't we? So they said, we always thought that there would be an archaeological site at Sanjan. I said, it doesn't work like that. You have to first identify a site. Once you have identified the site, you have to then apply for permission. They said, we already applied for permission in your name and we had no clue that a site had to be identified first. So I raced pell-mell back to Pune the next day, issued all the topo sheets that I could, spent 24 manic hours figuring out how to conduct an emergency survey, and then raced down with my dad in his sumo to Sanjan. The first thing I realized was that everything that had been written about Sanjan before was wrong, purely because the place where the site of Sanjan would be, the ancient site, would be the highest navigable point on the river. And that was very, very far away from the present town, which once again, as I've said before, was actually built when the railways were built. And every 7 to 9 miles, the railways had to build a station in those days. And those stations would be named after the closest village available. Therefore, there is Umargam and Umargam Road. And then there was Sanjan Bandar and Sanjan. So the modern town of Sanjan was less than 150 years old, is what immediately came into focus. So we looked at where we should have, and much to our surprise, we found an archaeological mound. We mounted an expedition, and this happened in November. By January, we were in the field conducting excavations at Sanjan. We tried to explain some important things to the principals of the project who were essentially not archaeologists. We explained to them that archaeology cannot really prove ethnicity 98 out of 100 times. So, a brick is a brick, a pot is a pot, a house is a house, and it's very, very difficult to actually find ethnic remainders. You don't get a Muslim brick, you don't get a Hindu brick, you get a brick. So unless that brick has an inscription or something inscribed on it, it is impossible to attribute that brick to a certain faith. And subsequently, anything that we will find in a settlement will therefore be that much difficult, and our evidence will be more circumstantial in nature than otherwise. Boy, were we wrong in proposing this very, very serious archaeological trope. So before the excavations, this is the situation that existed. And I include this because when you work in the medieval period, you cannot work without taking into consideration published literary sources, be they quasi-historical, semi-historical, or even oral traditions, and of course, any history that actually exists. So, well, what did we have? We had the oral traditions of the Parsis. We had the epistolary accounts of the Parsis. We had the inscriptional evidences from Kaneri of the Pahlavi inscriptions of the very late 10th and the early 11th centuries AD. We had certain other epigraphical instances which came to us from a series of copper plates called the Chinchani copper plates found at a small village south of Dahanu called Chinchani. And we had numerous references by foreign travelers and geographers, mainly Arab travelers. So the oral traditions are a very garbled and confused tradition. How many ships were there? Where did they go? How many people were there? What happened to them? There are myriad stories, and all of them are very, very fuzzy about who, where, when, and why. I suppose 1200 years later, this is bound to happen. What we then had was two accounts called the Kisses. The Kisse is Sanjan by Dastur Bevan Kekobat Masdia Sanjana, dated to 1600 AD, December 1600 AD to be precise. And the Kisse is Artustiani Hindustan by Dastur Shapur Sanjana, somewhere in the middle of this 18th century. We also had the epistolary sources, the 26 rivayats, starting with Nariman Hoshang's from 1478, where we wrote to the Zoroastrian priests of Iran from Navsari, and we received a large number of replies to our questions, though we never were asked any questions about what was happening here, which is incredibly weird. The inscriptions at Pahlavi are three very, very well-known and two lesser-known inscriptions at Cave 90. The first two are dated to about 1009 AD, and the third to 1021 AD. The other two are far too damaged to be dated at all, and all that they do is list very Persian-sounding names, not even Zoroastrian-sounding names, incredibly Persio-Zoroastrian or whatever you'd like to call them names, so and so, son of so and so, so and so, son of so and so, etc., 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 visited here. That's it. The first two are about 45 days apart, which is peculiar, and have all the same members. The second has a repeat of 4 members from the first group and is 12 years later. So most of the epigraphical references that come to us are from the Rashidun copperplate grants of Indra III and Krishna III. And they specifically talk about a site called Sanjan. They talk about its prosperity, its governance, and these are part of what are called the Chinchani copperplates, which are a group of 5 copperplates. The third is the Chinchani copperplate of Chamundaraja, who was the ruler of Samyana, which was Sanjan. He was the vassal of Chinturaja of the northern Shilaras, and this is dated to 1034 AD. The last 2 plates are fascinating, and sadly not enough work has been done upon them. They're issued by independent rulers who ruled from Sanjan, called the Modha rulers of Samyana and of Samyana Pattana, and are dated 1034 and 1053 AD. These plates describe the rise of Sanjan from a small town and port to a large city-state, a Pattanam, during the Shilahara period, and they talk in detail of its secular nature. They talk about the presence of Zoroastrians. Yes, they actually talk about Parsis. It says the Hanjumana Mandala, the Anjuman. It also talks about Jains over there. It also talks about grants to a temple being encroached by another temple, so on and so forth. And fascinatingly, okay, it actually talks, the Rashtrakuta grants actually talk about a Muslim governor of the port, okay, a Tajik governor called Muhammad, who is the governor under the Rashtrakutas. The Modha vassals claim to rule the state of Sanjan and mark its northern territories near Agashe, which is just where the Shilahara Modha boundary would be, and it is a considerable kingdom being ruled out of Sanjan. A large number of Arab travelers also talk about Sanjan. And this is very interesting, and this is something that Zoroastrians seem to not know. So when we do our epigraphical work and we do our textual research, we realize that there are an absolute who's who of Islamic geographers and travelers who talk about the site of Sanjan. Al-Biladuri, Ibn Hokal, Al-Ishtikari, Al-Masudi, all between the 9th and the 12th centuries AD. They talk about political organization, transit times, goods sold, bought on various ports. We also have the Persian account of Buzurg ibn Shahryar al-Ram Hurmuzi. We have Khordabadi, and we have ultimately, of course, many of the others in passing who refer to Sindan, Sanyan, Samyan, etc. They always say that it is north of the port of the great port of Chaul, where they also say, by the way, that there is a fire temple of the Zoroastrians, something that we have never been able to locate since. Modern research, of course, is the famous M.M. Marazban's English translation of Delphine Menand's work, Parsis of India. We have D.C. Sarkar's work on the Sanjan copper plates or the Chinchani copper plates. And interestingly, and this is something we found out very, very much later, was a small note in an article by J.M. Unwala on his excavations, okay, at Navsari, where he talks about a small-scale excavation carried out by Sir Jivanji Modi at Sanjan. And sadly, none of the data from that excavation is known to us. And what little data existed at the Kyarkama Oriental Institute has been lost since. Then, in 1983, H.D. Sakalia put all this data together and published a very, very interesting article called Sanjan, a miniature Bombay in 980 AD. And where he said that before Bombay rose to prominence, it was Sanjan that was the most important port on the northern western coast of India. Now, the kisses are terribly bad poetry. Anybody who knows Persian poetry of this era knows that it's not a great era for poetry, and anybody who reads the kisse would rather dig his intestines out of the blunt teaspoon. It's a really, really bad work of poetry. Thankfully for us, it exists because it's a very, very interesting quasi-historical work. The kisse Zarastrix in Hindustan basically is identical to the kisse and then continues where the kisse ends and takes on the story from Navsari from Udwada to Navsari. So what does the Kisse say? It tells us that the Zoroastrian empire of Ghaznagar Sharia was destroyed. It tells us that the Zoroastrian refugees escaped to the mountains of Kohistan. It says they lived there for 100 years. It says they came down to Hormuz, where they stayed for 15 years and they took ship to India. Now, they didn't just come and pack themselves into a ship and leave like most Zoroastrians think. This was a planned exit. There was a very carefully planned exit strategy. And this was because from the Sasanian times, there was an enormous amount of trade with the west coast of India, and they knew where they were going. They first landed at the island of Diu and lived there for 19 years. Now, this is one of the few specific numbered dates. 19, not round figure of 20 years. And the question that you need to ask is why they lived on a God-forsaken rock like Diu. And it's obviously because between the northern territories and the southern territories, the vast number of refugees that came would have upset the local balance. It is therefore they finally made landfall in a tribal buffer zone between what was ultimately the Solankis and the Rashtrakutas in the north and the south. They lived there for 700 years and were once again confronted with an Islamic invasion. So it's very dramatic. The Kisse says, after so many years, Islam came once again. The forces of Sultan Mahmud under his General Alf Khan, says the Kisse, invaded this region. There was a valiant defense. The Parsis were asked by the local Raja, probably one of the descendants of the Moda kings, to stand along with his armies. They did. There was even a hero called Ardeshir Sanjana. On the second day, Sanjan fell despite all of this, but it gave the priests and the laity enough time to scamper off into the hills of Barot. They stayed at Barot for 14 years and they finally went into hiding in Pasta for 12. By this time, in this interim 26 years, the entire bulk of Zoroastrian commerce, history, tradition, etc., culture shifted to Navsari, and the Setias of Navsari came and escorted the Iransha and the Sanjanas to Navsari because it was very difficult to enter the dense forests of Pasta, especially during the monsoons. And of course, they brought the Iransha to Navsari. Ultimately, of course, as the Kisse Zartustan Hindustan tells us, they ended up in Udwada. So the World Zoroastrian Cultural Foundation and the Indian Archaeological Society jointly excavated Sanjan for 3 years from 2002 to 2004. The late Dr. S.P. Gupta and I were the directors of the excavation, and there was a large, complex team of people that worked along with us. The original premise, as I told you, to prove Zoroastrian ethnicity was not a very good idea, but contrary to what we were scared about, the results were nothing short of spectacular. This is the site of Sanjan. It is virtually just across the border from Maharashtra into Gujarat. In fact, at Sanjan station, there is a Sanjan West, but there is no Sanjan East or Sanjan South as it should be called, because the other side of the railway tracks is actually Maharashtra. So much so that when the Gujarat board decided that all primary education would be in Gujarati and not in English, the people of Sanjan actually built a school on the other side of the railway line. It's called the Jadhirana High School, and it's under the Maharashtra State Board, and it's an English school. This is the layout from Google Maps. What you see here is the Nargol sandbar. This is Nargol over here. This is the Nargol sandbar or the Danda. This is Umargam and the Umargam sandbar. And this was a huge bay once upon a time, hundreds of thousands of years ago, which slowly got silted as silt from the mountains came down the Varoli River, and that's the Varoli snaking out to the sea. This over here is the Tukkar Nala coming in, and various waterways that are formed. This is ancient Sanjan, all of this. This line that you see here is the railway line, and this is modern Sanjan and the railway station that you see over here. This is the Portuguese fort that was built in Sanjan in the 16th century AD. This is the medieval port site, actually, the anchorage. And these are all the ancient mounds over here. which have sadly over time been damaged, destroyed, quarried for soil to make bricks, and not much of it is left apart from this area, which is the Machiwad or the fisher folk village of Sanjan or the village of Sanjan Bandar over here. So we have archaeological remains from here, and we have archaeological remains from here, and then again from the edge over here. The center of the site has all been dug out and turned into bricks, sadly. This was the view I got when I reached Sanjan the first time. It was luckily, I mean, this is serendipity, luckily high tide, and there was a beautiful 30-ton ship sitting across in the harbor, bang opposite Sanjan. So yes, that's what a harbor looks like in the medieval period. Medieval harbors are not what you envisage in your minds today when you think of a harbor. This was the first piece of ceramic that we found on the site. It was a beautiful, it's two fragments of Sasanian Islamic turquoise glazed ware, which fit together. They're part of a large buffware jar, which would have been used for transporting goods. This is the terminal Sasanian ceramic and continues in the Islamic period all the way to the 11th century AD. And it is found all over the Indian Ocean littoral and all the way to Taiwan. We systematically conducted our excavations and we were completely gobsmacked with the results. What you're seeing over here is the excavation profile. And I'm sorry if it doesn't make much sense to everybody, but this is the surface. We have massive brickbat debris over here. This is the terminal kind of, the heyday of the site is over here at this line on top of what is 3 and on top of what is 5. So this was where the heyday of Sanjan started. And this is when the heyday ended somewhere around the end of the 12th century AD. Then there was minimal occupation and the site seems to have completely disappeared by the beginning of the 14th century AD. These are ring wells. Ring wells are a very, very interesting attribute of urbanization. You rarely see ring wells in a context that is not urban. And you never see them clustered in a non-urban context. What these ring wells are is basically a septic tank. Because in an urban setting, you can't let your toilet and bathroom and kitchen water just run into your backyard because houses are back to back. Pits are dug and then a tube of terracotta rings, large terracotta rings is placed inside this. Sides are packed. Throughout the day, water from your bathroom, your toilet and your kitchen goes into this ring well and settles in the night. So from time to time, the solid waste is removed and thrown away. So these ring wells are a very, very important marker of urbanization in the Indian subcontinent. They start as early as the 6th century BC and they continue all the way to the 12th, 13th century AD in southern India. And this was the first time we had them in an early medieval context in South Gujarat / North Maharashtra. This is an overhead view of the same. These are the 3 ring wells that you see. And this is a beautiful, to an archaeologist, structure over here. It's a massive brick structure. This is a beautiful brick wall over here. And there is an inner dividing wall. And a lot of the bricks have been stolen in the later period. And of course, in the later period, you have reuse of bricks and smaller houses and brickbat floors made out of crushed bricks stolen from the earlier structures. This wall is very interesting because it was under this brick over here that we made one of the most spectacular discoveries. We prepared this area for photography one night and came back the next morning to find this corner brick, this brick over here, had been knocked off by children playing catching cook in the evening after we had left the site. I was sorely tempted to quietly put the brick back, but well, archaeological rules drummed into me, said no, it had been displaced, it needed to be prepared again. The cementing material, which was basically river clay, needed to be removed. The whole thing needed to be prepped all over again for the next day. As we removed that river clay, we found this. This is a cut fraction of an Abbasid silver dinar datable to the 9th century AD. And this is one of the silver dinars of Harun al-Rashid. This completely blew our minds when we found it. And alongside it, we found this. This is the first known silver issue of the great Rashtrakuta Emperor Amogavarsha Nripatunga, who ruled in the 9th century AD and who ruled right from the borders of Tamil Nadu all the way to the borders of Gujarat and the whole of the Deccan. And he was undisputed ruler of this entire territory in the 9th century AD. This is the first coin with his name on it. That is on the right-hand side, an elephant walking towards right. That is the royal insignia of the Rashtrakuta dynasty. And these two coins found in tandem together told us that they were being used co-evilly. And this was very, very important for us to understand what was happening here. We also found some very beautiful beads while excavating at the Sanjan Bandar. The top row and the ones on the left haven't been cleaned. The one on the right has been cleaned. These are what are called eye beads. And these eye beads come to us from the 6th, 7th century AD to the 8th century AD and the 9th century AD from West Asia. These are beautiful glass bead over here, a purple colored glass bead. There is no parallel for this. Small agate beads, carnelian beads. These are very, very popular from the Khambat region. And areca nut shaped beads or supari shaped beads, which are very popular in India. These are made out of terracotta. We also got these beads called gold foil beads, which look like there is a gold foil between two layers of glass. There's no gold. It's just two different densities of glass and refraction. But these are very late Roman Byzantine beads of the 8th, 9th century AD. And they were also spectacular markers for this level at the site. And the next year, while excavating on the other periphery of the site, we found an amazing number of agate beads, all kinds of shapes and sizes. This is not from the excavation. This is from the site, but not from the excavation. At the end of that season, I was approached by a local gentleman who wanted to sell me a necklace of beads gathered at the site. He had been told by a Babaji that his son, who was not well, had the evil eye on him, and that if he collected these beads and made him wear them, he would be fine. The son had grown up, his sons were now growing up, and he had this beautiful necklace that he had made. It's actually a small necklace for a child. And he'd done this because he owned the only shop in Sanjan Bandar, and he paid all the little kids to bring beads to him in exchange for boiled sweets. So I was quite shocked as to how I would be able to purchase this. We had no budget in the excavations to do so. It would be from my own pocket, but it would be something worth having. And expecting a rather high price from him, I asked him what he wanted, and he said 250 rupees. I haggled with him mercilessly to 225 and then paid him 250. Well, you know, my name is Dalal, and I can't let something go away just like that, can I? We also found these beautiful glass bottles. We found an enormous amount of West Asian glass from Sanjan, just enormous. I mean, there were bits and fragments of glass in every dig that we were digging up, chura glass all over the place. And there were these two semi-intact bottles. This one on the left is completely intact, which we got from the house that I showed you. This is an 11-sided, 11-faceted glass bottle. And my wife Ria was doing the glass. She's also a trained archaeologist. She was doing the glass from Sanjan. And we were at the Strand bookstall, and there was a beautiful book by Carboni on the greatest Islamic glass collection in the world, the Al-Saba collection. And she was just flipping through it when she came across a page with a 9-faceted bottle and a 13-faceted bottle. Ours would have virtually completed the set. This is a 10th century AD West Asian glass bottle. We also exposed the sides. This is a road on top where you see that child squatting. And we found the foundation of large numbers of houses. And we also found bricks jutting out into the river itself. This is the river section. We were very intrigued as to what was in the river. And we quickly put up a trench between the few days that we had when the tides were low enough. And much to our surprise, we found the bottom of a well. This told us that a large part of the site of Sanjan has been swept away by the Varoli River because it's on the cutting bank of the river. So, there would have been so much more which is gone today because the river has steadily been cutting at the site of Sanjan. This is a view of the site of Sanjan from across the river. You can see two of the Machi women on the bottom left-hand side collecting levtas at low tide over here. These are the mangrove swamps which get filled up. And this is the road on top. And this is where our excavations are being conducted in the final season. And you can see a ladder over here. And that's me looking across the river at the rest of my team. In the second season, we excavated at a place called the Koli Khadi, where we found enormous evidence of large-scale metalworking and pyrotechnic activities, lots of burnt clay, ram brickbat floors with large terracotta vessels buried into the floors to hold water. So if you notice carefully, you can see one over here, you can see another one over here, and you can see this one that we're removing here. This is Dr. Abbasid, who studied the ceramics from Sanjan. And this is the team slowly taking them out as we number every single piece, which was then washed and finally put together for an exhibition that we did with Parzor way back, I think in 2003, 2004, and UNESCO. So 700 rupees of super glue back in those days, and the skin from 3 pairs of fingers. And this is what we got at the end. This was one of the troughs over there. We also got some amazing turquoise glazed ware jars. This is a beautiful 3-handled jar. This is the top of a jar. We got gorgeous Chinese porcelains of the Yu and Qingbai types, telling us that not only was there trade continuously coming from Persia to Sanjan in the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries AD, but the same ships coming from the Persian Gulf and stopping at Sanjan were also continuing on to China and stopping at Sanjan on the way back. So there was Chinese ceramic from that period that we were getting for the first time. We were also getting some beautiful Chinese stoneware with these beautiful footed bowls in a dark green stoneware from the site. We had beautifully painted glazed buffware, more painted glazed buffware. This is a small drinking cup. And we had this very, very odd pottery called sgraffitoware. These are bowls, they're glazed, they're color splashed, and then while the glaze is still wet, the glaze is incised with a blunt pen-like metal instrument to make these designs as graffito, as they're called. You can see what looks like running a, very artistic running herd of horses over here on this one. And if you look at this one, it looks like peacocks. To some people, it looks like it's some kind of pseudo script. We also found this beautiful Kashan luster glazed ware bowl. And this is a 4-legged bird looking over its back. And what looks like Arabic over here is not really Arabic or Persian, but is pseudo script. Everybody wanted to own bowls with writing on them. Few people could write and fewer people could read. So these pseudo script bowls were made for, well, people who could not read as such. This comes from Kashan and dates all the way to the 13th, 14th centuries AD. We have a number of bowls with this bird on them. This is the outside of the same bowl. Please note, inside, outside. You can see the shine in the glaze glinting off. We have this eggshell ware, which we think is from China. We have a lot of local red and gray ware. This was one of the only intact pieces of ceramic from the entire excavation. It's a tiny little bowl. We also got a beautiful, either an unguent jar or an inkwell in the shape of an elephant. This is what is called a zoomorphic or a theriomorphic vessel. There is a small terracotta vessel in the center to which clay has been applied to form an elephant. And you can see the opening on the back over here. When we were exploring the site, the locals told us of a mound on the very eastern periphery of the site, locally known as a Bhastu. Now, Bhastu is a word we've come across before in describing abandoned Zoroastrian dogmas in this region. So we looked at it very carefully, and this was a small mound which looked very man-made because it didn't fit with the rest of the terrain. And we very carefully excised every single plant over here and then conducted excavations. This is what we got. This is the beautiful Taurus of a collapsed wall made up of brickbat, debris, and soil from the site, inside which there is the beautiful platform, and it's just over 6 feet from the center well over here to the platform edge. There's some brick riveting over here that has survived. In the center is a beautiful brick well, which would have been the bhandar of a dokma. This would have been the pavi as such. And this is the eastward facing entrance, which truly in keeping with all Zoroastrian dokmas is slightly off from true east. Don't ask me why. They're either slightly 5 or 10 degrees northeast or 5 or 10 degrees southeast, but they're never due east. Okay. So we had this amazing structure, which is exclusively and purely Zoroastrian. There is absolutely no doubt about it. So the ethnicity that we thought we could never prove was absolutely and totally seen at the site over here. So this is the actual excavation of the Dokma, and this is the platform. It has a 5-degree slope towards the center. This is the small bhandar. It's not very deep, and the lowermost level is beautifully covered in lime. We found a lot of lime and a lot of skulls lying over here together, and lots of bones on the inside. Lots of the bones also had bangles amongst them, beautiful intact glass bangles. These are just 2 examples of the glass bangles, and a large number of toe rings. Yes, toe rings. Now, I was speaking to Dastuji Kotwal after the excavation. I was quite surprised. I mean, the bangles I could understand, you know, the chital and things like that, but I couldn't understand how they would end up inside a dakma, because we are placed in the dakma the way we are born, right? With nothing on us. And this is when Dastuji Kotwal told me something very interesting. He said, till about 200 to 250 years ago, Parsi women had this thing about wanting to be taken to the dakma with their bangles on, because this was a sign that they would have predeceased their husbands, because these bangles were a sign of their, well, marriage status, and they wanted to be taken to the Towers of Silence when they were still married and their husbands were still alive. So I said, oh, that's fascinatingly interesting. What was also interesting was, he told me, that Parsi women traditionally all wore silver or mixed metal toe rings. And that in Navsari and I've actually then immediately gone and checked, in the Navsari old age home, there were still women who wore toe rings. So Parsi women, very much like Gujarati and Maharashtrian women, as a sign of marriage, the marriage status, wore on their index toe, as next to your big toe, a silver or a mixed metal ring. Now, these are all from the Sanjan Dokma, all of these. The top row and the first, second, third, fourth on the bottom row. And this one is from the Sanjan Bandar. Not to be confused with Bhandar, I know. We didn't choose the Bandar name to mix you up. We just chose it first because it was the Bandar. And this tells us that, again, these are very, very coeval designs. And we're looking at a coeval step. So, ladies and gentlemen, to make a very, very long story short, the evidence of a Dokma proved without doubt that this was a Zoroastrian settlement. The enormous quantity of West Asian glass, the enormous quantity of West Asian ceramics and Chinese ceramics told us that Sanjan was heavily, heavily occupied in all kinds and all manners of commerce, and was a very, very important part with the Zoroastrians, obviously keeping those links that they had with Hormuz and other ports very, very much alive. So we were not just religious refugees, we were more economic refugees than anything else. I know that comes as a bit of a blow to us. In addition, we recovered coins of the Yadavas, we recovered coins of the local rulers, the Gadia coins, or the Indo-Sasanian coins as they're called. We recovered silver coins of the Amirs of Sindh, telling us that in the 9th and 10th centuries AD, Sindh was very much a trading partner in this region. And of course, we have the coins of Harun al-Rashid and the Rashtrakuta Emperor Amogha. We have one more coin from the excavation, which is similar to the one from the house that was found. And it tells us that there was a flourishing town over here. Now, I'm sorry I don't have a photograph to show you, but at the site of Koli Khadi, just below the surface, we found a beautiful coin of Alauddin Khilji. And under that layer, we have a beautiful graveyard laid out with 6 extended burials, all with their faces turned towards the west, and absolutely no grave goods at all. It appears to be that the Dukmanashini system was perhaps overburdened right at the end, and that some kind of an aramgah was put together, perhaps. It's very, very difficult to tell this way or that way. But the coin of Alauddin Khilji gives us a very, very good chance that the Sultan Mahmud that we are looking at, whose General Alf Khan was responsible for attacking and destroying Sanjan, was none other than Sultan Mahmud Alauddin Khilji. Yes, that was his first name, Mahmud Alauddin Khilji, whose general was called Alf Khan. Now, there are about 7 contenders for Sultan Mahmud, all of whom had a general called Alf Khan or Ulf Khan or Ulugh Khan. So the Kisse could have been a little more specific, but sadly it isn't, because it's talking about an event that happened at least 300 years before it was written down. So, ladies and gentlemen, the Sanjan excavations proved, number one, that the Kisse Sanjan was quite spot on and was not just quasi-history but history. It also proved to us that there was a massive flourishing town. It was a Zoroastrian city with, of course, others, and that it was a very, very big player in the Indian Ocean literal trade of that time and that period. The subsequent dispersal of the Zoroastrians is also something that is historically well known, and there is more and more archaeological work now being done on the coast to try and look at similar data coming from other sites. And the excavations of Sanjan have not just added to the archaeology and the history of the Zoroastrians, but have created a set of West Asian ceramic markers, which are now being used from Balita, which is next to Kanyakumari, all the way to Khambat, to identify sites belonging to the early medieval period. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much to GeoParsi and to Parzor for inviting me, and to all of you all for listening to me. If there are any questions, I will be very, very happy to answer the same.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kurush Dalal. That was brilliant. You have questions. The first one is there any proof or definitive evidence that we first landed in Sanjan? And the same person, Yazid Kaparia, has asked, can you connect the objects excavated and the Parsis? Did they belong to the Parsis, or could they have belonged to anybody else?
So, number one, now that we have everything else neatly tied up by the Kisse Sanjan, I see no reason to doubt the landing at Diu. Is there evidence at Diu? Well, that is a work in progress. We are conducting intensive explorations at Diu, and we hope, and in the case of Diu, it does look like modern Diu is a bang on top of medieval Diu. So we've got word out that if anybody's breaking down a house and putting in foundations, they will kindly ask us to come over and let us observe the foundation making, in the hope of looking at strata that belong to an earlier phase and looking at similar evidences of West Asian ceramics. But remember, 19 years is a very short period. There is an Agyari at Diu, by the way. It was built much later, and surprisingly, it was built at Diu. The Portuguese weren't normally very happy to have Agyaris and things like that. Subsequently abandoned by the Parsis, and it's run by a Christian mission who actually keep the Qibla locked and open it for any Parsis who come. So it's been reused, but they've been nice enough to not desecrate the sanctum. And Parsis used to regularly go there and light a devo over there, come back. So circumstantially, there is strong enough evidence. The connection between the objects excavated shows a series of links that are so intense with Persia that we have no links like this anywhere on the coast elsewhere. Other sites yield a handful of West Asian ceramics or West Asian glass. Here we have them by the bloody kilo, if not virtually the quintal, which tells us that the kind of truck could not have happened if there wasn't Vyavar between us and Iran. So remember, we came down from the hills and spent 15 years at Hormuz before we left for 19 years at Diu, and then we landed at Sanjan. And please remember that we named Sanjan in memory of a town in the Khorasan mountains,
Yes.
which was called Sanjan and which still exists today in the Mazandaran province.
Yes. Yes.
So the town of Sindan is still very, very much there. So, circumstantially, the data is enormous, and the presence of the Dokma just kind of blows everything else away.
Uh, Thank you. I just want to ask, there are a few other questions linked with this. One is, are there any artifacts in the style of the Sasanians at any locations here? I think you answered it, but Anita is asking this. So if you'd want to say anything more over here.
So, uh, so far, none, surprisingly. Though we know that there was a Sasanian embassy which went to the court of Pulakesin II in Karnataka. So far, surprisingly, none.
Uh, could you show, this is Ruzbe Umrigar, could you throw some light on the Zoroastrian excavation of Pataliputra by Sir Ratan J. Tata in the late 1800s, and what age does that excavation date the Zoroastrian presence?
Okay, so it was not a Zoroastrian excavation. Ratan Tata funded the excavations at Pataliputra carried out by by Spooner. And Spooner's excavations at Pataliputra were funded, and this was a hugely magnanimous gesture for that time and that period. And Pataliputra's existence goes back to the pre-Mauryan period, and the Bulandibag area was carefully excavated by Spooner, and we actually have the remnants of the Mauryan palisade wall of Pataliputra. So the excavations are not Zoroastrian excavations at all.
Okay.
So there are interesting Achaemenid vestiges of the post-Achaemenid period that are seen amongst the Mauryans, like the famous 100-pillared hall. But those are, well, probably artisans fleeing the destruction of Persepolis and the destruction of the Achaemenid Empire.
Okay, I think that's the hall you're talking about, which this Rusbe is asking, is it the Ashoka throne room?
Yes.
Okay, okay. Then there's some questions, general questions about the persecution of the Zoroastrians for the second time in Sanjan, etc., etc. So, is there any?
They weren't really persecuted. That is one of the tragedies. Sanjan was destroyed because it was an incredibly rich port on the way down, and Alauddin Khilji was the first of the Islamic invaders to actually make inroads into peninsular India. The Islamic presence on the west coast till then was a very benign presence of traders, and it was a very different Islam from the one that came overland, which was the Turkic Islam. And Alauddin Khilji basically went like a hot knife through butter down the coast and then swung in for the capital of our good friends, the Yadavas, and the Yadavas didn't even see him coming. They bent knee to him, offered tribute on an annual basis, and he went back. We have evidence of Alauddin Khilji also further south, thanks to our excavations carried out at Chandor in Maharashtra. We now know that a little ahead of that, near Divyagar, we also have a coin of Alauddin Khilji from there, from a small hoard, telling us definitely that these are, small dots on the way that we can join together. Sadly, the Yadava ruler Yamchandra Deva was a little stupid, and he stopped sending tribute to Alauddin Khilji. So then Alauddin Khilji came and vanquished the Yadavas. And the sheer volume of loot that he took back. See, he didn't really care whether you were Hindu, Muslim, Christian, or you were a bigot, you were a polytheist, you were an atheist. He was interested in loot at that point. And the sheer volume of silver that he took back, Alauddin Khilji's silver coins, where he calls himself Sikandar al-Thani, the second Alexander, are some of the most collectible coins in India for young collectors because they're affordable. You can still get a decent silver coin for as less as 2,000 rupees. That's because he minted them in such ginormous quantities that the Mughal mint actually had Alauddin Khilji coins as its bullion reserve. And we found them in rotten leather bags in a secret chamber of the Mughal mint when the roof collapsed onto it. And we realized that we were looking at a hidden chamber. And a couple of tons of Alauddin Khilji silver were in there. At as late a date as the beginning of the 19th century. So Alauddin Khilji wasn't really, and see, realize this, after he destroyed Sanjan, the Parsis flourished on the coast. The Parsi persecution actually took place in the Portuguese period. And all the Parsis till Daman almost vanished on the landscape because there was a lot of pressure on them to convert to Christianity. And if you talk to the Palsatias, etc., there are very strong family traditions about this in the region of Nargol, etc. And it was only after the Portuguese were driven back by the Marathas that the Parsis kind of, re-emerged as being what they were. And then they became the medieval landlords of that entire region. I mean, that is a chapter that we Parsis are quietly brushed under the blanket as such. But we had massive landholdings that we took from the Marathas, and we turned sugar into a cash crop. It's the only time in India that rice into a cash crop. It's the only time this was done. Small landholdings were 5,000 acres. The Daviyarwalas had 15,000 acres. The Veds of Surungi had 22,000 acres. And Manchesha Karbari, who was the Kapori Tuti Kapo of the Parsi landowners, had 40,000 acres of land. Massive acreages were brought on the rice, complete feudal law. The tribals were virtually owned by the Parsi who owned the land, and they worked in exchange for toddy. It was not the most glorious chapter in Parsi history, and it's a good thing that most Parsis try to ignore it in some ways, but it's not something we should ignore. We should be cognizant of, our feet smelling in our shoes too. But that's maybe a talk for a different day.
I think there are lots of talks for different days, but there's one question from Viraf Mullah. Have you written a book on this? Can we get any book?
I've published a number of articles. My work on the literary traditions in the archaeology is published by the Sahitya Academy in its volume that Kumi Vevaina has published. I also have a number of articles in the Journal of Indian Ocean Studies on the excavations at Sanjan. And there is a book on the excavations of Sanjan and the archaeology of the Zoroastrians in the making, but it's at least 5 years away.
There's a question about any links with the Solset story. That's all that's story. Can you explain, please? The Solset story, sir, links here. Is there any? Solset would be much later, right?
Solset was much, much later.
Yeah.
See, the Parsis have a very interesting history, and you have to understand it in context. The Solset Parsis and the Mumbai Parsis were two different groups of Parsis. Very, very different. In fact, the Solset Parsis were very envious of the riches of the Mumbai Parsis, and the Mumbai Parsis were very envious of the size of the houses and the open air of the Solset Parsis. Though there was truck and there was marriage and things like that, both sides considered themselves superior to the other. My mother was from Bandra. My father was from Kot. You couldn't get more Mumbai than that.
Yeah.
And when my mother was to marry my father, one of her fuis said, "Are, pela Kot na Parsi ho, ye log ko to poro ne daraj khai roj." Which basically translates as they only eat omelets and dal every day. Now, this is actually because the food situation was such that fresh vegetables were not available in South Bombay till very late when the railways made it possible for the Vasaiwalas to regularly bring down vegetables. So, you
Okay.
know, there are so many different layers and nuances, and the fact that at one time there was a competition to build agyaris and everybody and his mother-in-law was building one, and they were built cheek by jowl with each other. Now we don't know what to do with them.
That's
So
also true.
there are all kinds of very interesting cultural, social phenomena. The Zoroastrians have a very rich heritage, which is sadly not uh, documented enough, shall I say.
Absolutely. And I think this poro and so dar khai, that's
Aad ne
that's a
poro
lovely
khaya
word.
kare logo.
Dar ne poro khai. You must tell that to Mayor Marfatia when she and Suni if they're writing another book. There is a question here. Is there any, from Anuj, is there any excavation being conducted presently in similar areas or any other parts on the Zoroastrians?
So Anuj, this was a one-off excavation. It was very, very well funded by the Indian Council for Historical Research in the first two seasons, the Tata Trusts in the third season. Um, Sadly, nobody in India understands that an archaeological excavation needs more money after the work is done in the field to actually analyze than before. So we asked the Tata Trust for 33 lakhs in 2003, 2004. They gave us 4.5 lakhs for a 3-year project. So I spent the entire amount of the excavation and gave them bills, and they said, how can you do this? And I said, very easily. I told you what I needed, what money for. I did 5 lakhs worth of work at 4.5 lakhs. Here are your bills. Thank you very much. I don't think they thought very kindly of me, but I wasn't thinking very kindly of them because the entire project was hamstrung by giving us less money. If they had not given us money, we wouldn't have initiated the project. But by giving us money and not as much as we asked, we were neither here nor there. So there's a lot of follow-up work that can be done, follow-up excavations that can be done now. So by the way, the human remains from the Dokma were systematically analyzed by an international team. There is a brilliant article in Genome Biology for which I get undue credit. And a lot of my colleagues hate me for my API scores because I get amazing rankings thanks to the scientists referring to that article. I'm one of 30 odd authors, but as the excavator, I kind of snuck in, which actually looks at the DNA of the Zoroastrians, some of the first DNA recovered in an archaeological site in India, because it's so difficult in India to recover DNA. And we're looking at a clan endogamous group, right? I will not discuss the results here because I don't want people to get violent. But yeah, there was some amazing work that's still coming out. There are, I think, at last count, 5 different masters dissertations just on the human remains from Sanjan.
Well, that's brilliant. But that's not in India, unfortunately. Am I right?
Oh, no, very much in India. At the Deccan College Library.
Okay, that's great. There's how do we, basically the question is, how do we get the articles you have written if they're available?
You can write to me. I'm kurushdalal@gmail.com. It's very simple. I'm Kurush Dalal at Instagram. You can tag me there and send me your email ID. I'll be very happy to share them with you.
Yeah,
I can also share them with Shernas.
yes, that would be lovely if we could put them up also.
Yes,
because
please.
you have researchers coming to our.
Please,
in fact,
please.
while you've been talking, there's somebody who wants to work with Farzor on something which you've done. So we'll talk about that later. So that'll be great, because if we could share these links, I think it's
Why not?
important.
I mean, these are in the public domain. I mean,
Yeah,
they are no longer my private jagir. Now they are very much in the public domain, and the more people that read them, the better it is.
the better it is.
So I have 5 articles which I can send you.
Thank you.
One will be a bit of a repeat. But yes, I can very happily send them to you. No problem at all on that count.
That would be wonderful. And if there are any more questions, or if anybody has raised their hand, I can't see if anybody has raised their hand. Matab, can you let me know?
No one's raised their hand.
Okay. So I think we also need a session, which I have heard you do brilliantly, on the wines of the Parsis. That sounds very interesting.
Propensity for production and consumption of alcoholic beverages by the members of the Zoroastrian faith in India, yes. That
Yes.
would be one hell of a talk to give.
Yes. Yeah, that would
It would be have to be after 7:30.
yes.
With a Parsi peg in hand.
Yeah, with a Parsi peg in hand. Thank you so much, Kurush. It's been brilliant. It's lovely to see you again. And I think everybody's had a great time. They're all saying thank you, awesome session, etc., etc. And of course, now your book has to come out. Thank you so
Well,
much.
maybe I'll apply to Parzor for a grant.
Well, Parzo will apply to you for a grant, I think. We're all in the same boat. But I really sincerely hope that there's so many people over here who have got great influence with others. Please listen to what Kurush and I are saying. We are trying to work on this history which nobody else will work on, frankly. And I think it is time that people understood that we need help. We need financial help to do this work properly.
And how?
Yes.
I'm sorry to say this, but the Zoroastrian community is one of the more better off communities in the world, not just in India. In India, we're probably on the top of the pile. And to think that the archaeology of the Zoroastrians could be calibrated, put together, and put into a definitive document for as little as about 10 lakh rupees from start to finish.
Yeah.
Okay? But it's not there.
So I think we need Heta and Firoza and everybody to start working on that. It's very, very important. Navroz Behram Faram wants to know, he's asked me privately, but I'm going to ask you because I don't know whether you're right now in Pune or Bombay. Where are you located?
So I'm exactly on the way between Pune and Bombay. I live in Kharghar in Navi Mumbai.
Okay. And Nilofer Marvelwala from America has said thank you so much. And of course, she's a great chef herself, and so I think she's going to be.
I've seen Nilofer's work.
Yeah, so she's going to be listening to you, and everybody is saying thank you very much, and we'll have you again, I hope. I know we took a long time getting you here, but you've been so busy we couldn't help it. So thank you. And thank you everyone for being here. Next week is a very, very interesting session. Yes, Shenaz, you will get the taped version. Next week, we have a very interesting session on Pariyamai. I don't know how many of you have heard about Pariyamai. So I do want you all to be with us. And if you have stories on Pariyamai or pictures of any thing you've done with Pariyamai, please do come back to us also. So next week we'll see you. Thank you, Kurush, very, very much. Thank you, Matab. Thank you all of you for being a great audience, and we'll see you next week. Thank you so much. Thank you.